Chapter 2 of Earthquake Terror. And Scruffy seems to have to be right here while I read it. Is Mommy going to die? Abby asked. No, people don't die from a broken ankle. She might have to wear a cast on her leg for a while, but she won't die. Mommy's never going to die, Abby declared. Mommy's going to live until she's 1,000,000 years old. Jonathan made no comment after that prediction. It seemed safer to change the subject. Let's play Sink the Ships, he said. Okay. It was a game they had invented last year when they came here at summer's end. Jonathan gathered large brown leaves from the woods. He and Abby stood together at the edge of the water right where Magpie Creek flowed into the lake. And he handed the leaves to her one at a time. She dropped them into the lake where they bobbed and floated like small boats. When all the leaves were adrift, Jonathan said, "It's time to sink the ships." He collected a handful of pebbles, gave half to Abby, and yelled, "Sink the ships! Sink the ships!" They threw the pebbles at the leaves, trying to make them sink. Abby clutched her walker with one hand and flung the small stones with all her might. She cheered whenever a leaf went under. Jonathan let her sink most of the leaves, enjoying her excitement. When the last leaf sank to the bottom of the lake, Abby smiled at Jonathan and said, "I'm hungry." "Me too." He opened the backpack and removed sandwiches, grapes, chocolate chip cookies, and 2 juice packs. Moose thumped his tail on the ground when Jonathan also found 3 dog biscuits. "I wonder if Mommy and Daddy are in the car yet," Abby said. "Probably. I'll bet they're driving out of camp right now. Maybe they're already going across the bridge." In his mind, Jonathan could see his father unhitching the small camping trailer. He pictured the car going along the narrow, winding road that meandered from the campground through the woods. He saw the high bridge that crossed the river connecting the island campground to the mainland. He imagined his father driving across the bridge faster. Driving the car faster than usual with Mom laying down in the back seat. Or maybe she wouldn't lie down. Maybe even with a broken ankle, she would wear her seatbelt. She always did, and she insisted that Jonathan and Abby wear theirs. Moose cocked his head as if listening to something. Then he ran toward the trail, sniffing the ground. "Moose," Jonathan called, "come back." Moose paused, looked at Jonathan, and barked. "Come!" Moose returned, but he continued to smell the ground and pace back and forth. "Moose wants Mommy," Abby said. Moose suddenly stood still, his legs stiff and his tail up. He barked again. "Silly old dog," Abby said. He knows something is wrong, Jonathan thought. Dogs sense things. He knows I'm worried about Mom, Jonathan patted Moose's head. "It's all right, Moose. Good dog." Moose barked again. "I'm hot," Abby said. "It's too hot to eat." "Well, let's start back. It'll be cooler in the shade and we could finish our lunch in the camper." Maybe he could relax in the camper. Here he felt jumpy. He didn't like being totally out of communication with the rest of the world. Whenever he stayed alone at home or took care of Abby, there was always a telephone at his fingertips, or a neighbor just down the street. If he had a problem, he could call his parents, or Mrs. Smith next door, or even 911. Here he was isolated. He wouldn't do well as a forest ranger, Jonathan thought. How do they stand being alone in the woods all the time? He unwrapped the uneaten food, buckled the backpack over his shoulders, and put the leash on Moose. The goofy way Moose was acting, he might bolt down the trail and not come back. Jonathan helped Abby stand up, placed her walker in position. Slowly they began the journey across the sand and into the woods to follow the trail through the trees. Jonathan wished he had worn a watch. It seemed as if his parents had been gone long enough to get part way to town, but it was sure hard to tell. Time had a way of evaporating instantly when he was engrossed in an interesting project, such as cataloging his baseball cards or reading a good mystery. But time dragged unbearably when he was in the dentist's office or waiting for a ride. It was hard to estimate how much time had passed since his parents waved goodbye and walked away. 40 minutes? An hour? Abby walked in front of him. That way he could see her and know if she needed help, and it kept him from going too fast. When he was in the lead, he usually got too far ahead, even when he tried to walk slowly. While they walked, Jonathan planned what he would do when they got back to the camper. As soon as he got Abby settled on her bed, he would turn on the radio and listen to the ball game. That would give him something to think about. The San Francisco Giants were his favorite baseball team, and he hoped they would win the World Series. Jonathan noticed again how quiet it was. No magpies cawed, no leaves rustled overhead. The air was stifling with no hint of breeze. Moose barked. Jonathan jumped at the sudden noise. It was Moose's warning bark, the one he used when a stranger knocked on the door. He stood beside Jonathan and barked again. The dog's eyes had a frantic look. He was shaking the way he always did during a thunderstorm. "What's wrong, boy?" Jonathan asked. He reached out to pet Moose, but the dog tugged toward Abby and barked at her. "Hush, Moose," Abby said. Jonathan looked in all directions. He saw nothing unusual. There were still no people and no animals that would startle Moose and set him off. Jonathan listened hard, wondered if Moose had heard something that Jonathan couldn't hear. Abby stopped walking. "What was that?" she said. "What was what?" Jonathan listened. He heard a deep rumbling sound in the distance. Thunder, he looked up. The sky was bright and cloudless. The noise came closer. It was too sharp to be thunder. It was more like several rifles being fired at the same time. "Hunters," he thought. "There are hunters in the woods, and they heard us move, and they've mistaken us for deer or pheasant. Moose must have seen them or heard them or possibly smelled them." "Oh, don't shoot," he cried. As he yelled, Jonathan felt a jolt. He stumbled forward, thrusting an arm out to brace himself against a tree. Another loud noise exploded as Jonathan lurched sideways. He dropped the leash. Abby screamed. "A bomb," Jonathan thought. Who would bomb a deserted campground? The noise continued and the earth moved beneath his feet. As he felt himself lifted, he knew that the sound was not hunters with guns. It was not a bomb either. Earthquake. The word flashed across his brain as if he had seen it blazing on a neon sign. He felt as if he were on a surfboard catching a giant wave, rising, cresting, and sliding back down again, except he was standing on dry ground. "Jonathan!" Abby's scream was lost in the thunderous noise. He saw her fall, her walker flying off to one side as she went down. Jonathan lunged forward, arms outstretched, trying to catch Abby before she hit the ground. He couldn't get there fast enough. The ground dropped way beneath his feet, as if a trapdoor had opened. His legs buckled, and he sank to his knees. He reached for a tree trunk to steady himself, but before his hands touched it, the tree moved. Jonathan's stomach rose into his throat the way it sometimes did on a fast elevator. Ever since first grade, when the Palmers moved to California, Jonathan had practiced earthquake drills in school each year. He knew that most earthquakes occur only along the shores of the Pacific Ocean. He knew that the San Andreas Fault runs north and south for hundreds of miles in California, making that land particularly susceptible to earthquakes. He knew that if an earthquake hit while he was in school, he was supposed to crawl excuse me, crawl under his desk or under a table because injury was most likely to be caused by the roof caving in on him. That was school. This was Magpie Island. How should he protect himself in the woods? Where could he hide? He struggled to his feet again. Ahead of him, Abby lay whimpering on the ground. Moose stood beside her, his head low. "Put your hands over your head," Jonathan called. The ground shook again, and Jonathan struggled to remain on his feet. "I'm coming," he shouted. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." But he did not go to her. He couldn't. He staggered sideways, unable to keep his own balance. He felt as if he were riding a roller coaster standing up, except the ground rocked back and forth at the same time that it rolled up and down. The clump of small birch trees swayed like dancers and then fell. The rumbling noise continued surrounding him, coming from every direction at once. It was like standing in the center of a huge orchestra with kettle drums pounding on all sides. Abby's screams and Moose's barking blended with the noise. Although there was no roof to cave in on him, Jonathan put his arms over his head as he fell. The school's earthquake drills had taught him to protect his head, and he did it the only way he could. Earthquake. He had never felt an earthquake before, and he had always wondered how it would feel. He had questioned his teacher that first year. "How will I know it's an earthquake?" he asked. "Well, if it's a big one," the teacher said, "you'll know." His teacher had been right. Jonathan knew. He knew with a certainty that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. He was in the middle of an earthquake now, a big one. The ground heaved, pitching Jonathan into the air. The end of Chapter 2.